Hello and welcome to another production of Probeline. This is a show put together by GrassRoots Community Network. And first I want to thank our generous and community-minded sponsor, A&B Bank of Aspen. We really appreciate their support for helping to make this possible. Probeline is meant to provide the opportunity for you to get to know city council and mayoral candidates who are running for March election and want to represent you. And our guest this episode is Scot Wooley. Did I pronounce it?
Nailed it.
Okay. And welcome.
Thank you.
I have an initial question for you.
Yeah, what's up, Rita?
I'm curious, what does representation mean to you in this setting of you want to represent people?
I think that's a really important question, specifically for this election cycle. For me, we live in a representative democracy here in America, and it's important for the leaders who get elected into service to put their own egos aside and reflect the will of the community, and that's what I really hope to do as a campaign candidate.
So the will of the community is not oftentimes monolithic.
That's right.
You know, how do you sort that out?
Well, I think that we kind of have, we have a couple hundred years of dealing with this issue. Some people would say that we need to institute some sort of supermajority to really make sure that we know that there's a strong, overwhelming majority in the community. Unfortunately, I think that typically leads to the oppression of the minority, and so
right.
You have what ends up happening is the 40% end up making the decision for the larger whole. And so 50% plus one is enough of a threshold for me to believe that our community has made a decision. We have several issues in this campaign where we've done that several times over the last 30 years, and it's time to move forward.
Have you been elected to office before?
Never elected office, but I've been appointed to several boards, the City Managers Students Advisory Council in Boulder, the Environmental Advisory Board there, as well as the APSHA Board of Directors here in Aspen.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you like the idea of public service?
Absolutely. My background from university is public policy in Mandarin Chinese. I'm service-minded. I believe that more of us need to step up into civic service to protect the amazing democracy and country that we have.
Where do you think you got that?
Well, that's a good question. My mom was a teacher for 30 years, so I'm sure I got a lot of the service-oriented kind of mindset from her. But my dad was also an entrepreneur. He started the Aspen Carriage Company here in town years and years ago. So that's also part of it, the provision of service for this town. But a lot of it probably came from the Benedicts. I was adopted by Fritz and Fabi Benedict really early on, and they were a cornerstone of this town and instilled in me an important vision of what philanthropy means.
Adopted how? Adopted?
Well, kind of brought into the family, supported, but never legally adopted.
Right.
They were a part of the generation of Aspen that was willing to and open to, really being generous with the community around them. They've given a lot of open space to this community, and basically they helped my single mom and, helped support me through college and were really mentors to me in my early life and helped create a vision for me to be service-oriented.
Boy, that's wonderful. What a deep sense of roots. And I imagine the stories that you heard or the conversations that you had around the table.
Yeah, when we could hear over the birds in Fabi's house, they were great conversations.
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. Thanks. I want to play a little game with you.
Let's do it.
I have these cards.
Okay.
And on these cards are questions.
All right.
And you get to pick where we're going to start.
This is exciting.
This is dead air. This is bad for television, but
that's all right.
We'll work this out.
Yeah, no, I like this idea. Let's go in the center here.
Okay, here we go. Scot, how do you deal with uncertainty?
That's a great question. I have a curious mind. I've always had a curious mind. I think the more you know you don't know. So uncertainty is something that I'm okay with, but requires kind of dedicated action in order to move through it. I think that realistically, there's nothing that can be certain in our lives. I mean, it's the theory of gravity. So how do I deal with it? Well, I would say community support and getting outside perspectives to kind of center me and figure out where I am uncertain, as well as self-reflection, self-expression. I'm a daily journaler, so I like to kind of explore that. And I've found that stream of consciousness journaling really helps me kind of get my ideas out on the page so that I can then reflect on them and move on to the next step. Now, uncertainty in policy is a whole other thing. I think if we're talking about policy, uncertainty is easily addressed through consultation with experts and in a representative democracy by consulting the will of the community.
Yeah, and there are no absolutes.
That's right.
You know, so at some point, you have to make a decision and move forward.
That's right.
But then maybe you have to readdress it.
Yeah. You know, an interesting metaphor that I was talking about with a community member last week was the sidewalks in a university. So almost every university in our country has this quad. And you have these awesomely designed sidewalks that go around the quad, but every single time you'll see that there are paths cut through the quad at certain angles. Public policy is kind of like that. Yeah. We need to move forward with building the sidewalks, but then we can address where we can adapt the sidewalks so that we match the path of the people. So I think that that's a good metaphor for kind of what is needed in public policy, which is the willingness to move through uncertainty, to make decisions, to be decisive, but then also the willingness to reflect on those decisions, move forward, and make incremental changes to those decisions as you kind of make progress.
And how do you see yourself as getting input for making that change or making that initial decision?
Personally, or as a representative leader, I think they're a little bit different.
Well,
personally,
let's talk about personally.
Personally, I mean, you've got close family and friends that I think play an important role in shaping our view of the world. I always like to consult with my family and my friends. You have kind of the greater community, the biggest circle around you, which is like social media, online research, lots of different information that was never accessible in the past. And something that I think is also important is to address people who don't agree with you and talk to people who, by definition, hold opposing views so that you can challenge your own perspective. So for me, that's something that I like to do. As in terms of Aspen governance, I think we need to really make concerted efforts to engage the community more, to get that kind of feedback, to be more open, and also to represent the people's voices more accurately so that they feel a sense of trust and accountability so that they're willing to make that step and engage with public policy.
Yeah, it's I think the accessibility of local elected officials is a major issue. You know, it's difficult to get to a meeting. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to commit and go. But then what are the other avenues that you can get your voice heard and known? I don't have the answer by any means, but...
Well, something that my brother told me the other week was, I said, well, you should go to a public hearing. You should go and say this to city council. He said, and what? They're going to have a memo about it and make it an agenda item and nothing will ever happen? And I can empathize with that kind of perspective about politics, that because of the way that processes and protocols are laid out, it doesn't feel on the ground, as someone who's maybe for the first time engaging with politicians, that it worked, that you got your point across.
Well, and the time is oftentimes very slow.
That's right, yeah. So you actually do have to put that item on an agenda for the next meeting before you can actually make a decision on it. And that's partially to protect the process of democracy and to make sure that nothing gets pushed through in policy that maybe shouldn't, that we have time for staff to review, for our leadership to kind of, percolate on the issues. And so in my mind, that's, again, a matter of trust. It's a matter of having the public really trust our elected representatives, that when I say something to them, they will percolate on it. They will, think about it and consult with staff and then make a decision on this item, which unfortunately, and I know we're supposed to not talk policies, is again something that I think a lot of Aspen residents are feeling a little bit disenfranchised, a little bit lacking in that trust with the public policy protocols as they are.
Right.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Okay,
That was wonderful.
let's go with closest to me this time.
Okay.
Oh, good one.
What role has luck played in your life?
Oh man, I am so lucky. I was born under a lucky star, and today I'm lucky to be able to say I live in a town like Aspen, Colorado.
Yeah.
The fact that I was born to such service-oriented parents, the fact that, like I said, there were generous community members who were willing to kind of wrap my family in and support us, and to be alive during a time when so much was possible. You know, the 90s was a time of peace and anything was possible, and things are getting a little different these days.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that just in my upbringing, I was very lucky. I was lucky enough to go to university, to have the privilege to travel abroad and do business in China for 10 years, and not end up in some gulag somewhere. Being in education in China can be a little bit of sketchy ground.
Did you live there?
I lived there for 10 years. I started a school that was, on its face dedicated to English education, but in actuality was more of an institution for critical thinking and global citizenry. So we wanted to help the children escape what is kind of a trap of Chinese education, and allow them to kind of expand their minds. And, I brought in some different kind of early education that maybe a lot of the parents there weren't comfortable with, a little bit more like a Montessori style education where they're able to explore ideas on their own terms. I did that for a couple years. I gave budgetary control to the teachers. My mom was a teacher for 30 years, so that was one of the first things I did. They didn't need me much after that, so I started a Thai restaurant, actually, in China, and then an underground speakeasy kind of social club underneath the restaurant after that. So I did those businesses for about 10 years, and then COVID hit, and it was difficult industries to be in when zero tolerance COVID policies got put in place. And basically, the Chinese government said, we want operational and budgetary control, and we want access to your accounts, and I said, going home.
Were you there during the lockdown then?
Yeah.
So, how do you, a hospitality business during a lockdown?
Yeah. I mean, the school, we had 500 students in our school, so that was a challenge in and of itself. But luckily, we had just brought the school to online platforms, so we were able to continue their education. The restaurant and the social club were a totally different beast because they were just closing and opening us on an almost weekly basis.
Wow.
And coming through, and we'd have to disinfect the whole place, and we'd have to, it was a whole process. And the margins of operating a restaurant, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, are pretty thin. Mm-hmm. So when you're going through that kind of operational cost, and you're not able to provide income to your staff, so you're going through a lot of turnover, it just really makes it untenable.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
That one.
I like that one.
This one isn't quite right for you.
Okay.
Scott, why did you come to Aspen?
Ooh, yeah, that's a hard question for me.
Yeah.
I didn't really have a choice. I was born here.
Right.
But the reason that I came back to Aspen after years abroad,
I think that's really
doing
good. Why do you
business,
stay? What brings you here?
Well, I've got a deep connection to this community, to the amazing natural resources that we have around us. I've been skiing since I was in a backpack that my mom was carrying. This is my home. I also came back because I heard my friends and my family talking about a disconnect between the vision that we have for Aspen and the way that people here are seeing themselves. Kind of a divisive politicking, a disconnect within the community. Interestingly, have you ever heard of the book, I think it's Mark Dunkelman, called The Vanishing Neighbor? Does that sound familiar?
Boy, I'd love to say yes, because then I'd appear smart. But no.
So this was
the closest I got to that was Bowling Alone.
Okay.
That's
a great one. Yeah. So Dunkelman talks about 3 circles of social interaction. And the premise is, everyone says the age of social media is destroying our society. And Dunkelman argues that that's not entirely true. that actually the inner circle, what he calls the home, our closest friends and family, that's actually strengthened. We've become closer with the people that we know we know. Our little insular groups are getting tighter and tighter. And then the biggest...
But aren't we siloed?
And then the biggest outside group, which he calls the cosmos, is like our access to information, like social media, online research. So if you were a fisherman 200 years ago, you knew the other fishermen in your town, but you didn't know about sea fishing in the Philippines. Now you've got all that access. So now that circle is strengthening as well. But the middle circle, which he calls the village, is in peril. He says that the inner circle and the home is where we learn trust, where we learn compassion and sympathy. The outer circle is where we learn understanding. But that middle circle, which he calls the village, is where we learn tolerance. It's where we interact with people that we know we don't know. It's where we're forced to interact with people who don't share the same perspective of the world. And it's where we learn to be empathetic and have this patience and tolerance towards our community members, because they're going to give you your coffee the next day, or they're going to be on the lift with you the next morning. And what I heard from my friends is that that village mentality, which is largely what Aspen was founded on after it was a failed mining town, is kind of disappearing. In the same way that it's happening all around the world, even in our little bubble, our little enclave of awesomeness that we have here in Aspen, it's starting to feel more and more disconnected. And so, as a service-minded person who always tries to find challenges that are seemingly insurmountable, I heard this from my friends and family, and I thought maybe I could come back and be part of a positive change.
How could city council do that? I mean,
Yeah, this is a great question.
I mean, we only have a half hour, and that's like a months long.
I know, I'll give you my number so we can talk about it later. Well, we already touched on part of it, which is creating an environment of inclusivity in terms of public policy, supporting the ideas of accountability and trust with the community, engaging with them more, addressing this concept of uncertainty and representation. I think for a long time in our governance, there's been a lot of ego on council where we decide to put it in a vote, and then the people who are elected representatives decide that that's not the direction that we want to go. Or we do a survey, and then the elected officials say, well, that survey result isn't really accurate.
Right.
And
I didn't get what I wanted out of that.
exactly. And that's not, in my mind, the purpose of elected representation. Our government is based on the idea that when the public, when the electorate speak, that the officials will move and make decisive action to accomplish the goals of the community.
Yeah.
So there are two things. One is build up the trust and authority and our accountability, but that's only going to happen once city council starts making decisions that the community can resonate with and reflect the will of the people. And so I think that it's kind of one of these loops where you have to do A before B, and B has to happen following A. But it's a big question, and the best answer, I think, is participation. The more that city council and the mayor can participate in the conversation and truly listen, and the more that the people are willing and able to participate in the process of democracy, I think that we will find a way to get out of this loop and start becoming an innovative community again.
Nice.
Yeah. I already have my eye on it.
That one?
That's the one.
Tell me about your most recent humbling experience.
They happen on a daily basis. I find myself humbled regularly because of the amazing people that live in our community. It's hard to walk 10 paces in this town without finding or interacting with someone who has some sort of incredible knowledge, expertise, or knowledge base somewhere in the world. To be specific about this, when we start talking about public policy and the nuances of public policy, I find myself frequently impressed with the community in Aspen and how knowledgeable they are about the issues. Without mentioning any names, because I didn't get consent, I was discussing with someone about the economy of Aspen. And I had this view of Aspen that was maybe a little bit rosy-eyed, a little bit optimistic. And they mentioned the economic distortion that's happening in our community right now. And this was something that I hadn't really considered. I had it in the back of my mind, and I think we all experience it if we're commuting into town. But the premise is 70% of our economy is based on residential services now. Mm-hmm. That's a huge overweighted sector. And so we have imbalance in the economy, and unfortunately, a lot of those tradesmen and residential service providers, they can't live in this community anymore. So when we talk about issues like traffic or the entrance or affordable housing or the economy, it's really interesting to find that they're all interconnected, that this is a wicked problem. And while many people will ask, what's the one policy that you'll choose to solve this one issue? It actually needs to be kind of a silver buckshot. So,
Right.
So there's 70% distortion in the residential services or towards residential services.
And this, by distortion, you just mean that our economy is lumped over here.
That's right. That's right.
And not dispersed with other
Right.
things. Yeah.
Right, and so that's in any industry, in any sector, that's a risk. When you're not diversified, there's a potential that if that one group suddenly raises their prices or isn't willing to drive into town or the demand changes, that's a huge reliance that we have in our town economically. And I hadn't really thought about that, but that's even more of an argument for supporting further arts and culture, for creating an economy where artists can come and live, for supporting small businesses and startups and locally owned businesses, because not only will it provide more local economic benefits, it will also help balance that distortion out so that our economy can be more sustainable into the long term.
All right.
Yeah, here we go.
This one?
That's the one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the one thing you wish you knew earlier in your career?
One thing I wish I knew earlier in my career. That's a really good question. Again, one thing. There's so many things that I wish I knew earlier.
Yeah.
It would probably be the importance of your network. I've always been a networker. I've always liked meeting people and building community around me. But I had a mentor once who taught me that in the process of giving, your hand is left in the position to receive. And I wish I had thought about that more deeply early on in my career, because there's so much that each of us can do to give back to our community, and not even in a selfless way, but in a way that understands that selfless generosity is going to be reciprocated, that a community that does that builds stronger bonds and has a stronger social fabric and ends up giving back to those givers maybe tenfold. Mm-hmm. And I wish that I had really implemented that in my daily life, especially in my business. Yeah, I think that would probably be the best answer.
What does that look like, though, in implementing that? You know, I appreciate the philosophy of it.
Yeah.
But like in your business, how does that selflessness get implemented?
So one good example is what I mentioned earlier about giving operational and budgetary control away as the manager and administrator of a school. A lot of people who get hired into a position where they have, 20 staff and 500 students covet that power of authority. And they end up spending a lot of their time working to hold on to it.
Right.
But I have an experience being a child of an educator, a teacher who worked in this valley for almost 30 years. And I knew that experience from her point of view. So in practice, what I did was give that operational and budgetary control slowly and with accountability
Right.
to the teachers, so that they're the ones who are buying the materials. They're the ones who are using the materials. They're the ones who are, in fact, the cornerstone of the operation. So who am I to say, to be authoritarian in this and top-down decide what they're supposed to do? A lot of people's ego might fight back against that. This might be one example of where I was able to give to them and it ended up being really valuable to them, to the
Yeah.
students, and to the success of the school, because, you know, they say that when someone is appreciated, they're more effective. When someone is given, you know, when someone is seen, they're more productive. And I think that I have firsthand experience with that.
Wonderful.
A good local example would be, again, a lot of the families in this area who selflessly gave our amazing open space to us, like the Moralts and the Benedicts. You know, they gifted a lot of the amazing land that we now use to walk our dogs and go skiing and hiking for community benefit. And, you know, there might have been some tax benefits involved, and there might have been some permitting issues that were negotiated based on those donations. But in a large part, you know, that was an enormous gift of generosity from these families for our community to benefit from it. And that's another great example of how generosity at one point ends up as a really kind of giving back to the community as a whole. Yeah. You're left.
What do you think sets a successful person apart?
Yeah, so I've been in education. I've been in kind of childhood mentoring and teenage mentoring. I've done it professionally, and I've done it in my own time, and I still do it with certain family friends and people who really need help in our community. And this idea of success is a problem for a lot of young adults, and even for not so young adults.
A problem achieving it?
The problem of defining it.
Defining it.
Because if you asked the Dalai Lama, and you asked Bill Gates, and you asked a school teacher, you'd get 3 different answers. So I think the Dalai Lama would say it's a matter of self-reflection. It's an internal state. I think Bill Gates would talk about success being driven by profits, by acquisitions and mergers. I think that a school teacher would say it's a matter of making an impact on someone else's life, on having this kind of, you know, endorphin rush of seeing a student make a breakthrough or smile when they've been sad, or, you know, I think all of those can be defined as success. So how do we want to define it here? I think it needs to be more holistic. We need to kind of look at success as economic, social, and environmental. And I think that's why Aspen is such an amazing place. I think that's why so many amazing people come here to live here. Whether it's the old timers or the people who have come since the pandemic, we share these values in more ways than we might want to admit. You know, I know a lot of us like to complain over beers, but just being in a place like this is a pretty good indicator of success. For me, what I'd like to see is people having a more holistic view of what success means. Sure, you need to be able to feed yourself and look out for the longevity of yourself and your family. But I would want us to fold a little bit more self-reflection into that, and satisfaction with our own psychological process, our own, you know, when we go home and close our eyes at night, are we feeling successful? Do we feel happy? And I'd also like to see us as a community and as individuals feel that feeling of success from helping other people. Like I said, when you reach out your hand to give, you're left in a position of receiving.
We only have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
But how do you, you know, when you're in public service, how do you separate or weave your public-private life together? I mean, it becomes very visible in some ways.
I mean, it's a good question, but realistically, I've always been a pretty visible guy. I kind of like to get to the tallest mountain, wave my arms, and say, hey, there's a problem that I'm wanting to solve here, whether it was through my original career in sustainability, through my later career in education, through the challenges that I faced trying to learn Mandarin Chinese and doing business abroad for a decade. I always put myself in a position to be on the mountain waving my arms. And so it's not as much of a problem for me, but what I think is a challenge for a lot of politicians is separating the values and interests of the personal and public. Like I said in one of our first questions, we need representative officials who are willing to let go of their ego, of their private interests, and look at the community as a whole with a balanced view of what success means so that we can move forward on community issues, so that we can reinstitute that feeling of trust and authenticity, and so that, I mean, in this context, so that we as Aspen can be an innovative community again.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Scott, I really appreciate this. This has been a very good conversation.
I wish we had more time, Reed.
Yeah, I do too. It'd be fun to keep going. But thank you again for taking the time to spend with us. And that concludes this edition of Probeline, a production of GrassRoots Community Network. Again, thank you to A&B Bank for sponsoring this and for your support of GrassRoots. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can create a show. So come and get involved. It's a fun place to be. And as the saying goes, no Aspen, watch GrassRoots. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Reed.
What a pleasure.
Really nice to talk to you.
It was great to